Howdy, my name is Tiffany Owen and I am the Instructional Coordinator for Lincoln and Fort Stanton Historic Sites here in southern New Mexico. Today I'd like to introduce you to one of the most iconic structures at Lincoln Historic Site, El Torreon. Now, when our school tours come to Lincoln, I often stop the students before they reach the interpretive sign and ask, what do you think this structure was used for? If you said to store water, corn, or grain, don't feel badly. Many students have guessed the same. Actually, though, the torreon was the first permanent structure built in Lincoln, probably around 1852. Now, let's find out why. Many of the early Hispanic settlers who came to the Rio Bonito Valley came from the Manzano and Socorro areas of New Mexico Territory. They were farmers and sheep herders who had lived near the Rio Grande. What do you think made them decide to move? Was it drought, raids by Native American tribes, or perhaps they just wanted better land and a better life? To the Hispanic settlers, valleys to the south appeared perfect for settlement. The soil was fertile for planting, game was abundant in the hills and mountains, and a river flowed through the valleys, providing water to irrigate farms and fields. Unfortunately, the water that had created the fertile valley and filled the river was from the sacred mountain of the Mescalero Apache people, Sierra Blanca. The Apache people did not want settlers moving in and scaring off the game, diverting water from the river, cutting into Mother Earth, or trespassing on their sacred ancestral sites. Despite concerns of Apache retaliation, a few families moved into the Bonito Valley. Families by the names of Trujillo, Chavez, Baldonado, Gomez, Gonzalez, Salazar, and Miranda were the founders of the new community that they named La Placita del Rio Bonito, or the village by the pretty river. The descendants of some of these families still live in Lincoln County today. Led by Enrique Trujillo, the families worked together to build a torreon. Torreons were common in early New Mexico settlements. They served as a place of safety and defense for the settlers. The word torreon means the keep in Spanish. In medieval times, the keep was the innermost stronghold of the castle. It usually served as the lord's residence as well as a place to hold political prisoners, since it was one of the most impenetrable parts of the castle compound. The keep was a fortified tower with thick walls and a protected entrance, and was usually the last resort for occupants of a castle to make a stand if the castle was under attack. At some point, castle defenders noticed that round walls deflected arrows, bullets, and other artillery better than flat walls, and so some castle keeps were built round instead of square or rectangular. Like the castle keeps that likely inspired these defense towers, the torreon at La Placita was most likely 2 or more stories tall and surrounded by a 10-foot wall to protect the small village inside the compound. Remember, there were no Home Depot, Lowe's Home Improvement, or Walmart stores for these first settlers, so they had to go find a place to quarry the rock, laboriously haul it back to La Placita, find trees that were tall enough to strip and make ladders, then build this 2-story structure by hauling each rock up the ladder and adding layer upon layer until the tower was tall enough. Although today's torreon in Lincoln has the door at ground level for visitors to enter, historic torreons most likely had a door up high so that villagers could climb inside, pull the ladder in behind them, and be completely protected. A sentry, or a person who keeps watch, would be on guard and sound an alarm at the first sign of danger. If there was time, the villagers would herd their animals inside the wall surrounding the torreon because their livestock was often the most valuable possession that the people had. Once inside the safety of the plaza compound, the men took their weapons and occupied the upper levels of the torreon, while the women and children huddled together on the ground level. The torreon had a fireplace for warmth, and the families mostly stayed there at night. The women only brought food for the children, but during the day, the villagers would come out to work in their homes and fields. This inset photo of one of the portholes shows that the walls of the torreon were built very thick to repel arrows and bullets. Our visitors to the historic site often assume that the small portholes were made to allow village defenders to shoot at an enemy on the outside. However, if you imagine placing a hand holding a gun in this small hole, you can see that the weapon would have had very little range and the shooter would have difficulty seeing his target. It is more likely that the portholes offered a small amount of light and, more importantly, ventilation. Can you imagine squeezing into this small space every night with everyone who lives in your neighborhood? It may not have been comfortable, but it was safe, and that made it possible for the villagers to sleep more soundly at night. The torreon had several advantages that made it an effective defensive structure. What do you think some of those advantages might have been? Before Billy the Kid or the Lincoln County War, the village of La Placita, which had by now been renamed Lincoln, was already a lawless and dangerous western town. In 1873, the Horrell brothers of Lampasas, Texas, were waging a race war against the citizens of both the Hondo and Bonito valleys. One night, word came to Lincoln that the dreaded Horrell brothers were coming to kill every man, woman, and child in town in revenge for the shooting of two of their brothers. Little Ella and Amelia Bolton spent the night with their mother and 27 other Hispanic villagers inside the torreon. Amelia Bolton would later be a force in saving the old stone tower. In July of 1878, the torreon was called into service again during the notorious 5-day battle of the Lincoln County War. Men loyal to the Murphy-Dolan faction took up positions in the old tower, prompting Alexander McSween, who owned the torreon property, to threaten to burn the occupants out of the torreon. Later, as Billy the Kid and several regulators dashed from the Montano store toward the sound of gunfire at the Wortley Hotel, the men holed up in the torreon began to fire at them, but Billy and his pals reached shelter unscathed. That night, a Lincoln resident named Daniel Huff had the unfortunate timing of being poisoned by a family member. Although the town was in lockdown and nobody was leaving their homes, Dr. Ely was sent for. But as he and Squire Wilson passed the torreon, the occupants heard them and began firing at the good doctor, forcing him to retreat back to the Tunstall store. Daniel Huff did not survive the poisoning, and although a grave was dug for him behind the Tunstall store, the men attempting a respectful burial were forced to unceremoniously dump the body into the grave and run for their lives when the men in the torreon fired again at the men who were just trying to bury poor old Daniel Huff. After the Lincoln County War, Susan McSween ordered the old stone tower dismantled. How much this order was carried out is unknown. By the early 1900s, like many buildings in Lincoln, the old tower came into the possession of the Southern Pacific Railroad. By the time the state of New Mexico acquired the torreon from the railroad in 1934, it had crumbled and fallen into disrepair. There was almost nothing left to symbolize Lincoln's earliest days. In 1935, Mrs. Amelia Bolton Church, the woman who, as a little girl, had found protection inside the torreon, worked tirelessly with the Chavez County Archaeological and Historical Society to save and restore the old stone tower. The torreon was thankfully restored under the Federal Reconstruction Act. Mrs. Church said, "I was interested in saving the old tower that was fast crumbling into ruins because we felt safer all through those dangerous years of outlawry, just knowing there was always a place of safety to be found behind its protecting walls. It helped keep us brave at times when we needed courage." Today, the torreon's days are serene and peaceful. As one of the oldest and most distinctive buildings in Lincoln, she has her picture taken daily by many of the 60,000 visitors who come to Lincoln Historic Site each year. During Lincoln's Historic Site special events, the torreon becomes a featured backdrop to living historians and local critters who share the dramatic tales of all the people that El Torreon protected during Lincoln's tumultuous settlement and the amazing events that she has seen. Thanks to preservation efforts by the New Mexico Department of Cultural Affairs, Lincoln Historic Site, and the Friends of Historic Lincoln volunteers, the torreon still stands, a survivor of several wars. Today, students and visitors can take in the view from the top and ponder the importance of this simple tower, built almost 170 years ago, to protect the settlers in one of the oldest communities in southern New Mexico, La Placita del Rio Bonito.